This year, nearly half of the world's population voted in at least 64 national elections, making decisions that will have consequences impacting Indigenous peoples' rights and sovereignty for years to come. I'm AJ Bird, coming to you from Saskatchewan, Canada, and right now everyone is watching the US presidential election unfold. How will this election impact Indigenous peoples and their rights? It's a crucial time to examine, through an Indigenous lens, how the US presidential administration impacts Indigenous sovereignty, land use, and treaties. I'm honored to welcome Professor Angela Riley to our show for this conversation on the protection of tribal sovereignty, sacred lands, and the ongoing journey to honor treaty obligations. Professor Riley is a distinguished international legal scholar and advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights, both in the United States and globally. She serves as Professor of Law and American Indian Studies at UCLA and is also the Special Advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous Affairs. As well, she is the Director of the UCLA School of Law's Native Nations Law and Policy Center. In our discussion, Professor Riley offers vital insights into how U.S. Supreme Court appointments shape Native American rights. She shares her perspective on the political and extractive forces working for and against Indigenous sovereignty and the enforcement of treaties. As a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma and a Chief Justice of her nation's Supreme Court, Professor Riley brings both academic expertise and lived experience to our discussion. Welcome to the AJ Bird Show. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Riley. We're very much looking forward to speaking to you today with regards to the U.S. politics and how it affects Indigenous nations in the United States.
Bonjour. Hi, nice to meet you and nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, we are very lucky to have you take time out of your very busy schedule. Your work as an international Indigenous rights scholar is very important, not only to the United States, but to the rest of the world. I do look forward to following up further on that. But we do have upon us a U.S. presidential election. And we did want to kind of determine a bit more on how an Indigenous lens on the U.S. presidential election will impact Indigenous rights. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my opinion, the most important thing that a president can do is to appoint Supreme Court justices. As you're probably aware, when President Trump was president, he appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court, and it caused some significant shifts in the court in terms of its ideology and the way that it decided cases in a whole range of contexts, including in Indigenous rights. So we are in a presidential election, and it's quite possible that the next president will appoint 2 justices to the court. And that could make a really significant shift in how Indian rights are viewed moving forward. And so I think that's really the biggest, most significant thing at least that weighs on me, is to think about who will be put on the court. Because as you know, our Supreme Court, these are lifetime appointments. And so young justices can serve many decades before they retire. So it's a really powerful tool of a president.
Absolutely. Now, in Canada, where I'm from, we do have an Indigenous lawyer that was appointed to the bench at the Supreme Court of Canada, which is, very, I wouldn't say surprising, but certainly very important. But with regards to the U.S. Supreme Court, and you mentioned a lifetime appointment, you could have a judge or a justice, I should say, that is, conceivably in their 30s or 40s that could be truly up until the end of their life. Like in Canada, we have a mandatory 75 age or years of retirement that must be upheld, not in the United States.
No, not in the United States. There's been some discussion of that because we have had some justices who've stayed a long time and in some people's views stayed too long. So there has been discussion of whether there should be either term limits or mandatory retirement age, but currently we don't have anything like that in place. So we have right now, I believe, 3 justices that are at least 70 and older, or maybe more. So as of right now, it's completely within their discretion when they decide to step down.
Interesting. Now, with regards to, specifically in the U.S. presidential election, has there been any, platform discussions from either candidate with respect to Indigenous land rights or Indigenous peoples?
Well, Vice President Harris hasn't laid out a comprehensive plan for Native rights in her administration if she is to be elected. But the track record of the Biden administration is very strong on Indigenous rights. I think many people feel that President Biden has been one of the strongest presidents for Indian country that we've ever seen. You've probably seen that very recently he, delivered an apology for the boarding school era in the United States, which obviously our countries have that in common. And also injected a lot of funds into Indian country through ARPA, which was aid coming around the pandemic, as well as numerous other things. So I think Biden has a strong track record, and to the extent that we align Harris with Biden's track record, I think it's a pretty positive sign. She has, made a lot of comments about tribal sovereignty and supporting Native nations, but of course, the Indian vote in the United States could be decisive in some places, I think Arizona in particular. So there's also a certain extent to which it's politically savvy to be appealing to Native voters at this moment. In terms of the Trump administration, I think it's really hard to say, primarily because in terms of at least the talking points that we know about what a Trump presidency would look like, Native issues just aren't at the top of the list. There are a lot of other issues that he's really hammered home on in his campaign. So it's a little difficult to say where Trump would come out. I think one place that some of us have concern is that there is a push. Both parties are going to be talking about energy and renewable and non-renewable resources. And I think there is some concern that a Trump administration would push more heavily on fossil fuel and other types of extractive industry that might impact Indigenous lands most profoundly. But as you are well aware, all of those kinds of energy sources can have negative impacts on Indigenous peoples.
Exactly. Now, with regards to the renewable energy focus that the rest of the world is very aggressive on, I would say, and looking at the different policies that are going to be happening internationally, um, especially with respect to, um, extractive industries that are required to fuel the renewable energy um, materials. How has that impacted Indigenous nations right directly there in the United States?
I would say the most profound example of that we see happening right now in the United States is it's embroiled in a lawsuit, Apache Stronghold versus United States, and now San Carlos Apache Tribe versus United States. So this is a case where there is a sacred site known as Oak Flat that is sacred to the Apache, and it is was has been protected for more than 6 decades as a sacred site and as a site that should not be mined or destroyed. And just a little over a decade ago, there was a rider that was put into a defense bill that was passed at the last minute that allowed for a land swap, pardon me, for that land to go into the hands of a mining company. And right now, the proposed mine is a copper mine. It would be a giant open pit mine that would destroy Oak Flat and would have enormous environmental consequences for the area for decades to come. So there are efforts right now to try to prevent that mine from happening. And copper, as you know, has very high conductivity and is needed for some renewable energy projects, including solar and wind. So it's sort of seeing these two interests come right up against each other in a very powerful case where the legal strategy really isn't about the energy piece of it. It's really about the First Amendment and the sacred sites litigation, which is how I think if the Supreme Court takes that case, that'll be the grounds that it'll take it on.
Interesting. Now, with regards to free, prior, and informed consent, has that been asserted in this legal case?
There's a lot of talk about how the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples will play into the strategy for Indian tribes in the U.S. as we move forward. But the United States has, although it has expressed support for the declaration in 2010 during the Obama administration, the U.S. has not explicitly implemented the policy of free, prior, and informed consent into U.S. law. It's a higher standard than what we see in U.S. law. Most of these projects in under American law would be focused more on rights of consultation, which are more procedural rights than substantive rights. So, at least in my view, I have not seen the United States implement or live up to an FPIC kind of standard. There is hope, of course, that it would move in that direction, but I don't think that that's the primary legal strategy here, and I don't know that the Supreme Court would find that the United States is held to that standard.
Yes, and we have in Canada, there's a term that's called duty to consult. So it's kind of blurring the lines between what FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, is, and what a Canadian standard of duty to consult. So there is a right to a duty to consult and a right of Indigenous peoples in Canada to be consulted, but it has not been interpreted further to the consent era on a veto right. So there's no veto rights at present in the United States for Native American tribes.
That's right. There's not.
And it's most ironic because sovereignty in the United States, we were speaking about this earlier, this is part of the American Constitution, is to recognize Native American rights, but also prior to the enshrinement of the American Constitution, there were treaties, and I don't know if they were called peace and friendship treaties, but we certainly had those in Canada, and we also had numbered treaties where they are enshrined in our Canadian Constitution. So it's most ironic and it's perplexing on how Native American sovereignty is recognized in the Constitution, but not actually upheld when it comes to encroachment and expropriation of their lands.
Yeah, I mean, the sovereign to sovereign relationship of tribes to the United States, in some sense, I would argue, is embodied in the Constitution in various ways, including the Indian Commerce Clause and the Treaty Clause. But Indian tribes were never fully brought within the Constitution. So the Bill of Rights, for example, by the Constitution's own terms, doesn't apply to us. We're bound by the Bill of Rights through something similar called the Indian Civil Rights Act. But yeah, I think that that's right. I mean, I think that there are important distinctions to be made between whether you're talking about Indian lands or non-Indian lands. In the case of Oak Flat, it's not on Indian land. It is, of course, land that historically did belong to the tribes of the region, but is now, at the time was federal land that was then swapped out for this project. Nevertheless, we are still subject to the plenary authority of Congress. And so even on Indian lands, Congress does have the authority in the United States to take a great deal of action when it comes to Indian affairs. And that's been interpreted to be quite broad at the Supreme Court. So, no matter how you slice it, we're sort of, we assert our rights of sovereignty. Our rights of sovereignty have been respected in many respects. Many people don't know that in the United States, we assert sovereignty and jurisdiction over our territory. We have, as you know, I'm Chief Justice of my tribe's Supreme Court. We have our own court systems, our own police forces, our own taxation systems, our own laws, our own constitutions, our own codes. But at the same time, we are still living within a colonial framework where Congress purportedly has authority over Indian affairs.
When we have these type of complexities, when you're working with not just your students, but also, as a Chief Justice, you encounter is there a lot of misunderstanding about Indigenous rights and sovereignty by non-Indigenous people in the United States, or do you find that it's more understood? Educate us a little bit on the American experience, please.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say, and I say this without any kind of indictment of my fellow American citizens, the United States education system and just sort of writ large doesn't teach the history of the process of Indigenous colonization in this country. In my experience working with Indigenous peoples and other countries all around the world, particularly I would say Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that history is much more directly taught and addressed than it is in the United States. I think that's for a variety of reasons, including that in the United States, sort of our original sin is slavery, and that is the history that's focused on more within the context of the U.S. And the Indigenous colonization is not really taught. And so in my experience, people know very, very little. But when they are educated or exposed to the Indigenous history, they're really open to it. They're really fascinated by it. I think people really do want to know more. And many people outside of Indian country and outside of Native nations in the US have no idea what it means to be living as a tribal sovereign within the borders of the US, or how we govern or what we do and what culturally tribes are like. And I think there is a genuine curiosity there and a genuine openness. Obviously, that's not true across the board, but I do really, I mean, I'm an optimist, but I do see a great deal of opportunity for us in the US because I do think many people, if given the opportunity to learn more about what's happening out there in Indian country, would welcome that opportunity. And I think people are, I think there is a level of sadness and, I don't know, pessimism that people aren't taught more of the history of our own country.
Yes, and we had spoken earlier, and I had mentioned how I had actually lived in the United States, and was known as entered the U.S. as a Native American born in Canada, and under the Jay Treaty. So we will probably have another episode on the work you're doing with the Jay Treaty. With regards to scaling back to President Biden's apology regarding the Indian boarding schools situation, I had to kind of put that in the context of Canada. We had something called Indian residential schools here in Canada, and I'm actually a first generation survivor. My late mother was over 14 years in three different Indian residential schools in the Northwest Territories. And one day school as well. And it has profoundly impacted Canadians to understand the Indian residential school experience. Do you feel that this recent apology may be a bridge to really begin those conversations and those hard truths that come out of really what was colonization of a culture to take the child from the nation to change them? Do you feel that this is an opportunity to really start engaging on a broader scope?
I really hope so. I'm very appreciative of the president, and also, of course, Secretary Holland for going out into Indian country and doing the listening sessions that led to the report and then ultimately to the apology. The history in the United States, much like in Canada, is a very long and very brutal one. And it's had enormous consequences for Indian country and for the survivors and the children and grandchildren of survivors of the boarding school experience. And I think it's impossible to really overstate the enormous impacts and trauma that that experience created. Of course, removing children from their homes without parental consent and putting them into boarding schools to try to assimilate them into becoming, white Americans, and cutting their hair and forcing them not to speak their languages and trying to convert them to Christianity, among many other things, in and of itself is absolutely horrific. And as a parent, I can't even imagine such a thing. But I think it goes so much further than that. What the history is revealing is the enormous amount of physical abuse, of sexual abuse, the trauma that happened to these children, and how many children died while in residence at these schools. And it's once you start to really get a fuller picture of that, it's hard to get your mind around that this happened and how long it went on. So I very much appreciate the president's apology, and I hope that it is opening the door to conversations. But there's so much healing that needs to be done in Native communities. And in my view, the United States has an obligation and a trust obligation to Indian tribes in the US to put as much time, effort, and resources into that as possible, including as much time, effort, and resources into helping tribes rebuild language, culture, land bases, et cetera, as it's spent trying to destroy them. Even a fraction of that would be a step in the right direction. So that's my hope. But it was a good day to hear the apology.
Yes, I mean, it's really hard to go forward without a recognition, and an apology is always the best first step, but it is not the only step. When you speak of Indigenous language loss, that is very much reverberated here in Canada. I myself am also affected. My people are the Dene, in the Northwest Territories. And I have heard it said that the Dene language, which is we're actually linguistically related to the Dine, the Navajo, that our language is one of the third hardest languages in the world to learn, which was very effective back to the US as a nation. Great warrior nation that very much respected Indigenous warriors as the very well-known code talkers of the World War II. And I do find that there's not only the disconnection with the language loss, but I think we'll go back again to land and the loss of land and the loss of use of land from an Indigenous, not just an economic, but a cultural sense. Can you kind of explain or give us maybe some examples of where the loss of land or the impacts of maybe extractive economies has created a change for nations to be able to use their lands as they had since time immemorial?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that I try to teach to my students as just an initial matter, if they're especially for non-native students, is to understand that Indigenous peoples are land-based peoples. We are connected to the places that we are from. The idea of religion is a word in English that doesn't even come close to capturing the relationship that Indigenous peoples actually have to place and to the universe that they're situated within. Spirituality also just sounds kind of frou-frou and doesn't really capture it either. So it's hard to translate into English what the experience is of Indigenous peoples who have enormous respect for the planet, and I'm speaking in broad generalities here. Of course, I don't mean to essentialize, but my experience with Indigenous peoples all around the world is that they have this in common: a connection with land, a respect for the planet and for the earth and for all living beings, and understanding their place within it. So it is really, in Potawatomi, we call it Jaganaganon, which means all my relations. And there's a word for it in almost every Indigenous language, which is just the idea that we are all really connected. And so everything about Indigenous culture attaches then to the place. The language develops in concert with the place. The culture develops in concert with the place. The foods people eat, the ceremonies you conduct, the times of year you do those things, all of this, the four seasons, all of it is connected. And so when you're dislocated and removed from your lands and dispossessed of your lands, you have then fragmentation around all of those things, fragmentation around culture and religion and language and all of it. And then, of course, the destruction of Indian lands takes that even one step further. So for many of us in the US, my own tribe included, we were forcibly removed from our Aboriginal lands and then placed on a reservation ultimately in what is now the state of Oklahoma. And there are 39 tribes in the state of Oklahoma where I grew up, and only a few of them are indigenous to the area. Most of us were removed on forced marches. Many people have heard of the Trail of Tears. My own tribe's march was called the Trail of Death. So most of us were removed from our Aboriginal homeland. So there's an enormous rupture there that happens that tribes then have to figure out how to connect back, to bridge those gaps, and to try to, recover from some of those really devastating events of the colonial period.
When we have so many different nations, we'll use your people's situation, and you said 39 tribes in the state of Oklahoma. Is there some tensions perhaps between the original Indigenous peoples tribes of Oklahoma and those that were forced to relocate there through U.S. government policy and law? Is there tensions today?
I don't think that there are tensions in that sense. I think there are probably tensions in other ways. There are a few tribes, I would say mostly the Plains tribes, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, a few others that were, nomadic migratory tribes, sort of horse and buffalo culture tribes that would have moved through the region that is now Oklahoma, sometimes as far down as Texas and maybe even into Mexico, and then up north into the northern plains. So there are a few that would have traversed that area historically during certain seasons, but like I said, the vast majority aren't from there. So it's an interesting dynamic, because in Oklahoma, of course, that means that we have a huge range of cultures and tribes. We have plains tribes, we have woodland tribes, we have southeastern tribes, tribes like my own Great Lakes tribes, whose history and culture is really rooted in a whole other place.
Yes, when you welcomed and said hello, bonjour, that sounds similar to Ojibwe language, which I
Yes.
recognize from my time living in Ontario. That was a very common hello or greeting that everybody understood, a bit
Yeah.
like bonjour in French.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, at one time we were all related. So,
So I'm learning so much from you today, Dr. Riley. Could you tell us a little bit more about your teaching work right now, your work as a professor?
yeah, absolutely. Of course, as you know, I'm a law professor and a professor of American Indian Studies at UCLA, and I've been at UCLA around 15 years, and I've been in academia for over 20 years. And I've been working on Indigenous rights ever since I entered academia. So my work focuses really on, I do a lot of work on cultural property and the protection of cultural resources from a whole wide range of perspectives, including tangible and intangible cultural property. So that's led me to be working pretty closely with the World Intellectual Property Organization at the United Nations on the negotiation of treaties for the protection of Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, sort of writ large. That's a project I've been working on for quite some time. And then I also do a lot of work on Native governance, which is built out of my experience in terms of being an elected official for my own tribe, but also working with and among and around a lot of Native nations for many years and thinking about governance structures and what Native governance looks like moving forward, which is, a very important piece of our rights of self-determination and sovereignty in the US. So that's really where I focus my work. And my scholarship is also in line with that. So I, like all professors, I do a lot of writing and publishing, and so that's the core of my research.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to reading more, watching more, and who knows, maybe there's some remote classes that people that are viewing could still avail themselves of. I do want to ask some questions with regards to your work. We were speaking briefly before about your amicus brief work and how you can assist the courts in your country in better understanding and recognizing Indigenous rights. Is that work that you undertake regularly?
I've been on a few amicus briefs. I wouldn't say that I'm the leading attorney in the US or law professor in the US who's working on it. We have some really amazing people who have been able to kind of institutionalize that work into their law schools. There are projects at Stanford Law School and others. I've worked on projects at UCLA, which is, of course, where I'm a professor. So, yeah, I think the amicus briefing strategy is incredibly important at all levels of the federal courts, but particularly when we're in the Supreme Court. The strategy is usually coordinated by a combination between the Native American Rights Fund and the National Congress of American Indians that really try to put together a comprehensive briefing strategy so there aren't too many briefs being submitted to the court, that they're hitting the points that need to be made, that they're informing the court, giving more context and nuance, and also letting the court know what's really at stake beyond just the briefs that go to the specific legal issue that the court's going to address. So there often is a law professor brief in these cases, and sometimes I'm a part of those briefs. And I think that it's a really critical part of the work that we're doing. I think there's an effort to try to expand that beyond just the Supreme Court and to have more amicus briefing strategy in lower courts at the circuit court level, even, and even district court if needed. So it's a big part of the advocacy that's going on in the U.S. And I like to think that it's making a difference. It's hard to know really because the court is somewhat opaque, so we don't really end up getting a lot of feedback from the court around their decisions.
Well, when you mentioned earlier with presidential appointees to the Supreme Court, there's also presidential appointees. We don't have quite the same system here in Canada, but there's federal judgeships as well. Those are presidential appointees at the state and federal level, federal courts. So there's a lot of opportunity here for education of legal professionals across the board. It's not just the Supreme Court of the United States where their education and knowledge of Indigenous rights is really instrumental. It's also even down at the state level. Is that correct?
Yes and no. In the US, so certainly Article 3 judges in federal courts are all sort of appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. And those are all lifetime appointment positions. So those are incredibly important. The way that our work happens in the US, because our relationship is as sovereign to sovereign is really between the United States and the federal government, most Indian issues are going to find their way into federal court. So the federal court judiciary is much more significant in terms of our rights in the US. Not that state courts are not going to get any native law cases, they do, but most of them will be in the federal court system. So again, the election of the next president, whoever it turns out to be, whenever there are vacancies in the federal courts, will be instrumental in filling those positions. And of course, there's an ideological perspective that comes along with that, and so it'll be really significant. A lot of it depends on retirements and how quickly the judiciary is turning over. So it'll be interesting to see how many vacancies we end up with in the next 4 years.
Yes. Now, and that's a 4-year cycle. And I have heard things that, well, we know that there's a 2-term limit for presidents. That doesn't just mean consecutive. That means 2 terms, irrespective. Say if former President Trump is reelected, is he still limited to 2 terms?
Well, I'm not a constitutional law scholar, but my understanding is that yes, he would be limited, that this would be the last term. But as we all know, and as we can see, of course, with the Democratic Party right now, oftentimes that's just making the way for the current vice president to ascend to the presidency. I don't know what J.D. Vance's ambitions are, but I would not be surprised if we did have another Trump presidency, if we didn't have a run for the presidency by Vance in the next election. But who am I to predict? I have no idea what will happen.
Yes, politics is always a bit of a dog's breakfast. At times, it's baffling to watch what is going on in the country. Of any election that's happening, we always hear lots of rhetoric. Has there been any rhetoric with regards to Indigenous peoples in this election?
I mean, I think that most of what we've been hearing has come more from the Harris campaign. And again, I think it's mostly to try to, reiterate support for Indigenous rights, which Biden was a big supporter as well. And I think also to, quite strategically speak to the Native voters in places like Arizona, where the Native vote could actually make a difference in the election, given the razor thin margins that it seems like this election is going to hinge on. So I do think there's an effort to really speak to Native issues, both strategically and substantively, by the Harris campaign. There's a lot less of that coming from the Trump campaign, as far as I have heard. And I don't know where Indigenous rights will measure at all if there's another Trump presidency. I think, as many people know, his number one issue that he's hit on over and over again is the border and immigration. And that's really where his focus has been. But there are, of course, tribes on the southern border of the United States who will be impacted by whatever happens in the coming immigration law. Whatever ends up happening in the US will impact those tribes at the southern border as well. So there's always an Indigenous piece of the story that doesn't always get told, but it will be an important piece for the southern border tribes.
Yes, I mean, I really, looking at the broad and the diverse situations that are happening state by state, depending on which nation is in what state, can really maybe impact their politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way the process works in the United States is that because we have this relationship of sovereign to sovereign that is between the United States government and Indian nations, that relationship depends on the United States recognizing the sovereignty of that Indian nation. So the powers that sovereigns have, including the power to tax, the power to incarcerate, having our own constitutions, all of those kinds of things are dependent in many ways on the recognition of our sovereignty. Those are things that an unrecognized tribe, or even just like, let's say, a social club or something, couldn't do. So recognition of that sovereignty is incredibly important for us to have that relationship with the United States. But the power of recognition lies in the United States. And so if the United States has not recognized a tribe for whatever reason, it's a long, complicated process. It's an expensive process. There are some tribes that were terminated decades ago that now are trying to get reinstated, so they don't have recognition. So it's a very complicated story. But without that recognition, they don't have the rights of full sovereignty that other tribes in the U.S. have. And so tribes in California, there are quite a few unrecognized tribes in California. that have been very creative and strategic. Many of them have organized themselves as nonprofit organizations and tried to undertake many of the same kinds of roles that a recognized tribe would take to the extent that they can without full sovereignty. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it's different in California than other states. Some states actually have more of a process to be a state recognized tribe. Some states, I think, just really don't pay any attention to tribes that aren't federally recognized at all. So you're going to see a huge variation across the U.S.
Yes, and I had noticed, and I think that's where my comment was about state judiciary appointees, the understanding more about Indigenous peoples because of state recognition.
Yes. I mean, there are issues that can end up in state courts, and certainly Indian Child Welfare Act issues. California is what we call a public law 280 state, so there's more California state jurisdiction in Indian country here in California than in many other states. So it really kind of is a patchwork of laws across the U.S.
Wonderful. In the language of my people, which I have yet to learn too much, but I'm working on it. Masi cho. That's a big thank you.
Well, and I say Chimigwech in Potawatomi back to you. Thank you, AJ.
Goodbye.
Bye.